My name is Clara. For 10 years, I was a wife, a role I poured my soul into. I believed in the life we were building. But divorce teaches you that some foundations are nothing but sand. It's a brutal amputation. It's a hacking away of a part of yourself, leaving behind a phantom limb that aches with memory. And the clean cut of the separation, the division of assets, the signing of papers in a sterile law office, that wasn't the worst part. That was just the surgery. The real cruelty, the infection that set in afterwards, was something far more insidious. It was the moment I realized the man I had built that life with, my ex-husband Mark, was going to use our dog Finn as a weapon. A living, breathing, terrified weapon designed for the sole purpose of torturing me. I remember the day he said it. We were standing in the hollowed-out shell of our life, the living room stripped of my books, my art, my presents. All that was left was his cold, minimalist furniture and the suffocating silence between us. He had agreed to everything else with a smug, dismissive wave of his hand. The house, the money, the investment, she didn't care. He wanted to seem magnanimous, evolved. But then he looked at Finn, who was pressed against my leg, trembling, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was a smile I had come to know and dread. It was the smile he got right before he broke something I loved. He dared to say, his voice a low, venomous purr, "You can have the house, the money. I don't care about any of that. But Finn stays with me. Let's see how you cope without your little crutch." The air left my lungs in a rush, as if I'd been punched. My little crutch, that's all Finn was to him. Not a member of our family, not a creature with a soul and a history of trauma, but a tool. My tool. And now, his. If you've ever had a pet held hostage, you know this pain. It's a unique and particularly vicious kind of agony. It's the helplessness, the rage, the knowledge that a creature you love, a creature that depends on you completely, is in the hands of someone who means you harm. People understand the pain of losing a child in a custody battle, but losing your fur baby, having them wielded against you, it's a grief that lives in a dark, lonely corner, one that society doesn't quite have a name for. But I knew its name. It was Mark. I'm sitting here now, in this quiet, empty-feeling room, a framed photo of me and Finn on the mantelpiece. It's from a happier time, a sunny day in the park. He's mid-leap, a blur of golden fur and joyful energy, his tongue lolling out, his eyes fixed on me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated adoration. Looking at it, my hands clench into fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. A single hot tear escapes and traces a path down my cheek. It's not a tear of sadness, it's a tear of rage. Because that happy, carefree dog in the photograph is not the dog Mark created. And this is the story of how I went to war to get him back. Mark's control didn't start with a bang. It wasn't a loud, dramatic declaration of tyranny. It was a slow creep, a rising tide of subtle manipulations that I didn't even notice until I was already drowning. It started with small things. Little comments about my friends, my clothes, my ambitions. He'd frame it as concern. "I just don't think she's a very good influence on you, Clara. Are you sure you want to wear that? It's a little loud. That promotion would mean more travel, more stress. Are you sure you can handle it?" He was an expert at making me doubt myself, at making his control feel like my own flawed decision-making. He was a master of the quiet, insidious erosion of a soul. I became smaller, quieter, less sure of myself. My world, which had once been vibrant and expansive, began to shrink until it contained only him. Finn's adoption was a turning point. Or rather, it should have been. I had always wanted a dog. Mark was indifferent, but he'd finally relented, a grand gesture of his supposed generosity. We went to a local rescue, and that's where I saw him. He was huddled in the back of his kennel, a skinny, terrified mix of what we thought was golden retriever and something else, something wild and watchful. His papers said he'd been found abandoned, severely malnourished. His eyes were wide with a terror that broke my heart. Mark was unimpressed. "He looks neurotic," he'd said, already turning to leave. But I couldn't leave him. I sat on the cold concrete floor in front of his kennel for an hour, just talking to him in a low, soft voice, not trying to touch him, just letting him know I was there. Eventually, slowly, he crept forward and licked my hand. That was it. He was mine. From that first day, Finn wasn't just a pet, he was my shadow, my comfort, my constant, loving responsibility. His anxiety was severe, a fact documented in years of vet records and training notes. He had profound separation anxiety. If I left the room for more than a few minutes, he would begin to whine, a high, keening sound of pure distress. If I left the house for an hour, he would panic, pacing, panting, scratching at the door. Thunderstorms were his personal hell. The first rumble would send him into a shivering, drooling state of terror. He'd try to climb into my lap, his big, clumsy body trembling uncontrollably. And only I could calm him. I learned his triggers, his fears, his language. I learned that the pressure of a weighted blanket during a storm would soothe him. I learned that the scent of a t-shirt I had worn would comfort him when I had to leave the house. I learned that a specific low humming sound I would make would bring him down from the edge of a full-blown panic attack. Mark, on the other hand, had no patience for it. He saw Finn's anxiety not as a symptom of past trauma, but as a personal failing, an annoyance. "For God's sake, Clara, he's just a dog," he would snap, when I'd spend half an hour calming Finn after a car backfired outside. "You're making him weak. You're coddling him." I see now that he was jealous. He was jealous of the pure, unconditional love Finn gave me. He was jealous of the bond we shared, a bond that existed outside of his influence, a bond he could not control. He saw my love for Finn not as a virtue, but as a threat to his total dominion over my emotional world, my little crutch. He hated that I had something that brought me comfort, something that wasn't him. And like everything else in my life that he couldn't control, he was determined to destroy it. The first few weeks after the separation were a special kind of hell. The silence in my new, small apartment was a physical presence. It was a silence defined by the absence of the click-clack of Finn's nails on the floor, the soft sigh he'd make as he settled at my feet, the gentle weight of his head on my lap. I was adrift in a sea of grief, and the life raft he had always been was gone. I begged. I pleaded. I debased myself in ways that still make me burn with shame. I sent Mark long, rambling emails, appealing to his sense of decency, a quality I foolishly still believed he possessed. I offered him everything. The rest of the money, my car, my grandmother's jewelry, I didn't care. None of it mattered without Finn. His response was always the same: more taunts, more cruelty. He would send me text messages, little poison darts designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain. I remember one, a screenshot of Finn lying on the floor, looking listless. The caption read, "Still miss your little crutch? He's fine, don't worry. Getting used to being a man's dog." Another time, after a particularly bad thunderstorm had rolled through the city, I texted him, my hands shaking. "Is he okay? Please, Mark, just tell me he's okay. Did you give him his blanket?" His reply came hours later. "He's a dog, Clara. Not a Fabergé egg. He survived." My heartbreak, a dull, constant ache, began to curdle. It slowly, surely, turned into a fierce, burning determination. This was no longer about my pain. This was about Finn's safety. I started getting calls from mutual friends, the few who hadn't been poisoned against me by Mark's lies. Their voices were laced with worry. "He's not eating, Clara," my friend Sarah told me one night, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Mark just leaves a bowl of dry food out, but he barely touches it. He looks so thin." Another friend, who lived in our old neighborhood, called a week later. "I hear him barking all the time," he said, sounding distressed. "Not normal barking. It's frantic, desperate." Someone in the building told me he chewed through a door frame last week trying to get out while Mark was at work. The final blow came from a text from Sarah. Mark had people over last night. He said Finn just hides under the bed for days at a time now. He laughed about it, Clara. He said, I think I finally broke him of his needy habits. He thinks this is a victory." That was it. The last vestiges of my grief were incinerated in a blast of pure, white-hot rage. My heartbreak turned into a cold, hard resolve. Finn wasn't just a pet being used as a pawn in a bitter divorce. He was my child, a traumatized, vulnerable member of my family who was being systematically abused and neglected out of pure, sadistic spite. Mark wasn't just trying to hurt me anymore. He was destroying Finn to do it, and I was going to burn his world to the ground to stop him. My lawyer, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Ms. Davies, warned me from the start. "Clara," she said, her hands folded on her neat, organized desk, "I need you to understand something. In the eyes of the law, a pet is property. It's like a couch or a television. Pet custody cases are notoriously, almost impossibly, difficult to win, especially when the other party is on the ownership papers." "He's not a couch," I said, my voice low and trembling with a rage I was struggling to contain. "He's a living being with documented medical needs that Mark is deliberately, maliciously ignoring." "I know," she said, her voice softening with a flicker of sympathy. "But a judge might not see it that way. It's going to be an uphill battle, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be ugly. Mark will paint you as an overly emotional, hysterical ex-wife." "I don't care," I said, my resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "I will move mountains for Finn. I will spend every last penny I have. I will not let him destroy that dog." She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze appraising. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Then let's go to war. But you need to be prepared. Mark is going to come across as the calm, rational one. He will be smug. He will be confident. He will do everything in his power to make you look unhinged." She was right. Through the preliminary legal wrangling, Mark was the picture of confident arrogance. He responded to our formal requests through his lawyer with a tone of bored amusement. He positioned himself as the responsible pet parent, the stable one, while I was the emotional wreck who was using the dog to continue the drama of our divorce. He was building a narrative, a false, poisonous story where he was the victim of my instability. He was so sure he was going to win. He had always won. He had no idea that this time he wasn't just fighting against his overly emotional ex. He was fighting against a mother protecting her child, and that was a battle he was not prepared for. As the court date approached, a cold, terrifying anxiety began to settle in my bones. Ms. Davies was right. The law was not on my side. Logic was not on my side. All I had was the truth, and a desperate, burning hope that we would find a judge who was willing to see it. I gathered my evidence. Years of vet bills with only my name on them. Sworn affidavits from our friends. A detailed log of Finn's anxieties and my specific methods for treating them. It felt like so much, and yet, it felt like nothing at all against the cold, hard fact that in the eyes of the law, Finn was just a piece of property, just a couch, just a thing. The day before the hearing, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for the fight of my life. I was not just fighting for Finn. I was fighting for every unheard voice, for every creature who had ever been used as a pawn in the cruel games of broken people. I was fighting for myself, for the woman I had been before Mark had tried to erase me, and I was terrified. The hallway of the family court building smelled of stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and a low-grade, pervasive despair. It was a purgatory of uncomfortable benches and flickering fluorescent lights, filled with people whose lives had fractured and brought them here, to this place of cold, impartial judgment. I sat on one of the hard wooden benches, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Ms. Davies sat beside me, a bastion of calm, professional composure, reviewing her notes. I, on the other hand, felt like my skin was too small for my body, my nerves a tangled mess of live wires. Then I saw him. Mark strode down the hallway as if he were walking onto a yacht. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, an expensive tie, and an expression of calm, confident concern. He was performing the role of the reasonable, heartbroken husband forced into this unpleasantness by his unstable ex. He was with his lawyer, a man with a reptilian smile and eyes that were as empty and soulless as Mark's own. As they passed, Mark glanced at me, his eyes flicking over me with a look of pity so profound, so perfectly feigned. It was a work of art. He gave a small, sad shake of his head, a gesture for the benefit of any onlookers, a silent performance that said, "See what I have to deal with?" I felt a surge of nausea so intense I had to close my eyes. He was so good at it, so convincing. How could a judge possibly see through that performance? How could they see the monster lurking beneath the bespoke suit? "Don't let him get to you," Miss Davies murmured, not looking up from her papers. "That's his strategy. To make you emotional. To make you look like the crazy one. You are calm. You are factual. You are here to speak for Finn. That's it." I took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded, my eyes still closed. I tried to picture Finn's face, the soft, trusting look in his eyes. I was his voice. I was his only hope. The thought was both a terrifying weight and a clarifying anchor. My fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. All that mattered was him. When the bailiff called our names, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body, and followed Miss Davies into the courtroom. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, and somehow more intimidating for it. It was all pale wood and muted colors, a space designed to strip away emotion and reduce human lives to a series of facts and statutes. The air was heavy, still. We took our place at one of the tables. Mark and his lawyer sat at the other, a chasm of polished wood between us. Mark arranged his papers with an air of calm deliberation, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. He would not look at me. To him, I was no longer a person. I was a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be overcome. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. She had a reputation for being tough, impatient, and deeply observant. Her name was Judge Elizabeth Rios. She took her seat, her gaze sweeping the room, and a profound silence fell. The proceedings began, a slow, grinding process of legal maneuvering and dry, technical language. Mark's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of Mark as a devoted, responsible pet owner, a man who loved his dog and was providing him with a stable, loving home. He submitted photos of Mark and Finn, photos I had taken of them hiking, of Finn sleeping on the couch. They were carefully curated images of a life that was a complete fabrication. Then, Mark himself was called to the stand. He walked with that same confident stride, took the oath with a hand over his heart, and sat down, turning to face the judge with an expression of earnest sincerity. He was a master performer. His voice was calm, reasonable, tinged with a carefully calibrated sadness. His lawyer began. "Mr. Hayes, could you please describe your relationship with your dog Finn?" Mark sighed, a long, sorrowful sound. "Finn is my best friend," he said, his voice catching slightly. It was a masterful touch. "He's been my rock through this incredibly difficult time. I love him more than words can say." I felt a rage so pure, so absolute, it was like a physical force. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell the judge about the text messages, about the laughter, about the way he called Finn my little crutch, but I just sat there, my hands clenched into fists, Miss Davies' warning echoing in my ears. "You are calm. You are factual." "And how has Finn been since the separation, Mr. Hayes?" his lawyer asked. "He's been great," Mark said, a bright, false smile on his face. "Really great. He was a little confused at first, of course, but he's adjusted wonderfully. We go for long walks every day. I buy him the best food. He's a happy, healthy dog." Lies. Every word was a lie. I could feel the affidavits from our friends, the vet records detailing Finn's anxiety, sitting in a folder on our table, screaming to be heard. "Ms. Miller, your ex-wife, has made some claims that Finn is suffering from severe anxiety, that he is not being properly cared for. How do you respond to that? Mark shook his head, his expression one of deep, profound sorrow. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a manufactured pity. I think, he said, his voice soft and full of regret, that Clara is projecting. She's going through a difficult time, and she's always been a little overly emotional when it comes to Finn. She means well, of course, but she tends to smother him. I think she's confusing her own separation anxiety with the dog's. He's thriving now that he has a more structured, less codependent environment. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. In a few carefully chosen sentences, he had painted me as a hysterical, unstable woman, and himself as the calm, rational, modern man who understood the psychology of the situation. He had taken my deep, fierce love for Finn and twisted it into a pathology. He was using the language of therapy as a weapon, a shield for his own cruelty. I watched the judge. Her face was impassive, her expression unreadable. She made a few notes on a legal pad, her pen scratching softly in the silent room. Was she buying it? Was this it? Was I going to lose him because of a performance? A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Mark's lawyer concluded his questioning. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. No further questions, Your Honor." Ms. Davies stood up to cross-examine him, and she was brilliant. She was sharp, she was precise. She presented the vet records, the affidavits. She questioned him about Finn's specific triggers, his medication, his routines. But Mark was slippery. He had an answer for everything. Yes, he can be a little nervous sometimes, but what dog isn't? I wasn't aware of that specific routine. Clara handled most of his training. I'm not a helicopter parent with my dog. I believe in letting him be independent. He bobbed and weaved, deflecting every question, turning every concern back on me, on my over-the-top methods. He was so plausible, so infuriatingly calm. I felt my hope begin to wither and die. He was going to get away with it. He was going to win. Finally, Ms. Davies sat down, her face tight with a frustration she was trying to conceal. Mark's lawyer stood up. "No redirect, Your Honor. The defense rests." Mark stepped down from the stand, a small, triumphant smirk playing on his lips as he returned to his seat. He had done it. He had won. He shot me a quick, venomous glance, a look of pure, gloating victory. I felt the tears begin to well up, hot and unstoppable. It was over. I had failed. I had failed Finn. I put my head in my hands, unable to watch anymore, the sound of the judge shuffling her papers a death knell in my ears. And then the judge spoke. Her voice cut through the thick, suffocating silence of the courtroom. It wasn't loud, but it had a quality of sharp, undeniable authority that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Mark looked up, startled. He had already sat down. The questioning was supposed to be over. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice once again dripping with respect and sincerity. Judge Rios leaned forward slightly, her elbows on the bench. She took off her reading glasses and set them down. She looked directly at Mark, and her eyes were like chips of ice. The impassive mask was gone. Her gaze was direct, piercing, and utterly unimpressed. "I have just one question for you, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I have read the affidavits. I have reviewed the veterinary records going back 4 years. I have listened to your testimony, and I have listened to the testimony of your ex-wife, which we heard earlier." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. Given Finn's extensive, well-documented history of severe acute separation anxiety, a condition that both parties acknowledge exists, what specific, concrete steps have you personally taken to manage his distress in the 3 months since Ms. So Miller moved out of the marital home? The air left the room. It was as if a vacuum had been turned on, sucking all the oxygen, all the sound, all of Mark's smug, self-satisfied confidence out of the space. His face, which had been a mask of calm composure, crumbled. It was like watching a building be demolished in slow motion. The smugness vanished first, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Then the confusion gave way to a dawning, wide-eyed panic. His eyes darted from the judge, to his lawyer, to me, looking for a lifeline, an answer, an escape, but there was none. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. He began, his voice a full octave higher than it had been on the stand. Well, I make sure he gets walks, and food. I give him food. He was floundering, drowning in the silence, his hands beginning to fidget on the table. He has toys. Lots of toys. I do all the standard pet care things. The basics. The silence that followed his pathetic, fumbling answer was the most profound, most damning silence I have ever experienced. In that moment, everyone in that courtroom, from the bailiff to the stenographer to the judge herself, saw him for exactly what he was: a fraud, a liar, a man who knew nothing about the creature he claimed to love, a man who had not taken a single, solitary step to care for its most profound and documented need. He had been so focused on his performance, on painting me as the villain, that he had forgotten the most basic rule of any lie. You need to know the details. And in the one detail that mattered most, he knew nothing. I looked at him, at his pale, sweating face and his panicked, darting eyes. His smug facade had been shattered by one simple, direct question. He was exposed. He was a king with no clothes, and the whole world was finally seeing his ugly, naked cruelty. A single, unstoppable tear of pure, unadulterated relief rolled down my cheek. It was the tear I had been waiting to cry for months. It was the tear of hope. The silence in the courtroom that followed Mark's pathetic, fumbling answer was a physical entity. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all other sound, all other thought. It was the sound of a lie dying, a loud, ringing silence that was more damning than any shouted accusation could ever be. In that moment, everyone in that sterile, wood-paneled room, from the bored-looking bailiff to the impassive stenographer to the judge herself, saw him for exactly what he was: a fraud, a performer, a liar, a man who knew nothing about the creature he claimed to love, a man who had not taken a single, solitary step to care for its most profound and documented need. He had been so focused on his performance, so consumed with the architecture of his lies about me, that he had forgotten the most basic rule of any deception: you need to know the details. And in the one detail that mattered most, the one detail that was the entire crux of this battle, he knew nothing. He had been exposed not by a clever legal trick or a dramatic outburst, but by a single, simple, devastating question. A question about care, a question about love, and he had no answer. I looked at him, at his pale, sweating face and his panicked, darting eyes. His smug, impenetrable facade had been shattered by one quiet question. He was a king with no clothes, a hollow man, and the whole world was finally seeing his ugly, naked cruelty. A single, unstoppable tear of pure, unadulterated relief rolled down my cheek. It was the tear I had been waiting to cry for months. It was the tear of hope, a hope I thought had died moments before. Judge Rios let the silence hang in the air for a long, torturous moment, letting Mark stew in the acid of his own public failure. She watched him, her expression one of cold, clinical disgust. She had seen through him. She had seen the monster beneath the bespoke suit. When she finally spoke again, her voice was like the crack of a whip. "The basics, Mr. Hayes?" she repeated, her tone dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. "You provide him with food and walks? That is your expert strategy for managing a well-documented chronic anxiety condition?" She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion of profound disappointment. "You have presented this court with a narrative in which you are the stable, caring party. Yet you have demonstrated a level of ignorance and neglect that I find, frankly, appalling. She picked up her gavel, the simple wooden mallet suddenly looking like a weapon of immense power. In the state of this law, it is true that pets are considered property. My heart seized, a cold fist of fear squeezing the hope from my chest. Was this it? Was she going to follow the letter of the law, despite everything? However, she continued, her eyes locking onto mine, the court also has a duty to consider the overall welfare and best interests of that property, especially when there is clear and convincing evidence of neglect, and when one party has demonstrated a malicious intent to use that property as a tool to inflict emotional distress upon the other. She turned her icy gaze back to Mark, who seemed to be shrinking in his chair, his face a blotchy, sweating mess of humiliation. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice now ringing with the finality of a death sentence, "it is clear to this court that you are not only unable, but also unwilling, to provide for Finn's specific and significant emotional and physical well-being. It is also clear that your primary motivation for retaining custody of this animal was not love, but a vindictive desire to wound your ex-wife." She lifted the gavel. "Therefore, I am awarding full and sole legal custody of the dog, Finn, to Ms. Cross. Miller, effective immediately." Bang. The sound of the gavel, striking the wood, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of chains breaking. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of my world snapping back into its rightful alignment. Mark's jaw dropped. He looked utterly, completely stunned, as if he had been struck by lightning. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, whispering frantically, but Mark didn't seem to hear him. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. He had been so certain of his victory, so wrapped up in his own arrogance, that the possibility of losing had never even entered his mind. He had been stripped of his cruelest weapon, his most satisfying leverage, in a public forum. He was speechless, defeated. But I barely saw him. All I cared about was Finn. The judge's words were echoing in my head. Effective immediately. Ms. Davies leaned over, her own professional composure finally breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. "We did it, Clara," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "We did it." I burst into tears, but these were not the tears of grief or rage I had cried for months. These were tears of catharsis, of a relief so overwhelming it felt like my bones were dissolving. "Finn," I whispered, the name a prayer on my lips. "I need to get him." The logistics had been arranged beforehand, a contingency I had barely allowed myself to hope for. Mark had been ordered to have a friend bring Finn to the courthouse, to be held in a small, private waiting room pending the judge's decision. The transfer was to happen here, in this neutral, impersonal space, to avoid any further confrontation. I practically ran out of the courtroom, Ms. Davies close behind me. I pushed open the door to the waiting room, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. And there he was. He was huddled in the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, his body trembling. He was so much thinner than I remembered, his golden coat dull and patchy. His eyes were wide with a familiar, heartbreaking terror darting around the strange room, his tail tucked so far between his legs it had disappeared. He looked broken. A part of me shattered seeing him like that, seeing the physical proof of Mark's casual cruelty. A young woman I didn't recognize, presumably Mark's friend, was sitting in a chair, scrolling on her phone, looking bored and impatient. She looked up as I entered. "Clara?" I just nodded, unable to speak. I took a slow step into the room, my heart aching. "Finn?" I whispered. His head shot up at the sound of my voice. His ears perked. His whole body went rigid. He stared at me, his brow furrowed in a look of intense, disbelieving concentration. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, my voice thick with tears. I knelt down on the floor, making myself small, opening my arms. "It's me. It's Mommy." And then, it happened. A flicker of recognition in his terrified eyes. A hesitant, questioning whine escaped his throat. And then, it was as if a light switch had been flipped on inside him. His tail gave a single, tentative thump against the floor, then another, and another. He scrambled to his feet, his nails scrabbling on the linoleum, and he launched himself at me. He crashed into my arms, a frantic, whimpering, licking whirlwind of pure, unadulterated joy. He buried his head in my neck, his whole body shaking, not with fear anymore, but with a relief so profound it was a physical force. He licked the tears from my face, his tail wagging so furiously his entire body wiggled with the effort. I wrapped my arms around his skinny frame, burying my face in his fur, breathing in his familiar scent, a scent I thought I had lost forever. "I've got you," I sobbed into his fur. "I've got you. You're safe now. You're safe. I'm never, ever letting you go again." He whimpered, a long, low, heartbreaking sound of release, and nuzzled deeper into my arms. In that moment, in that sterile, impersonal waiting room, we were the only two beings in the universe. The months of pain, of anger, of sleepless nights and desperate pleas, all of it melted away. All that was left was this: the simple, profound, unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. He was home, and so was I. The young woman watched us for a moment, her bored expression softening into something like wonder. She stood up, placed his leash on the chair, and quietly let herself out of the room, leaving us to our reunion. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other on the floor of that waiting room. Finn's frantic energy slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering calm. He rested his head on my shoulder, letting out a long, contented sigh, a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. The trembling stopped. The light began to return to his eyes. He was still skinny, still anxious, but he was mine. He was safe. Finally, I clipped on his leash. As we stood up to leave, I looked at my boy, truly looked at him, and for the first time in months, his tail was not tucked in fear. It was held high, wagging softly, a frantic little flag of victory. We walked out of that courthouse together, leaving the ghosts of the past behind us in the stale, despairing air. We were walking out into the sunlight, into the beginning of our new life. The war was over, and we had won. The drive home from the courthouse was surreal. The city, which had felt so hostile and gray on the way there, now seemed vibrant, almost technicolor. The sunlight felt warmer, the sky a more brilliant blue. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe the color was returning to my own world. Finn sat in the passenger seat, belted in safely. He didn't look out the window. He never took his eyes off me. He just stared, his head cocked to one side, his brow furrowed with a look of intense, profound concentration, as if he was afraid that if he blinked, I might disappear. Every few minutes, he would let out a soft, low whine and lean over to lick my hand as it rested on the gear shift, a quick, wet, desperate reassurance. "You're real. You're here." I kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his head, stroking his soft fur, murmuring to him the whole way home. "We're okay, buddy. We're going home. We're safe now." When we walked into my small, quiet apartment, he was hesitant at first. It was a new space, with new smells, and his old anxieties began to surface. He stayed close to the door, his body low to the ground, his tail giving a few nervous, uncertain tucks. The trauma of the last few months was a ghost that still clung to him. I didn't push him. I just closed the door, took off his leash, and went about my routine as if this were the most normal day in the world. I talked to him constantly, my voice a low, steady monologue. "Okay, buddy, let's get you some water. You must be so thirsty." I filled his bowl, the one I had bought for him the day I moved in, the one that had sat empty for 3 agonizing months. He watched me, his amber eyes tracking my every move. That first night was a delicate dance of memory and reassurance. I didn't have his old bed. Mark had probably thrown it out, so I made him a new one on the floor next to my own, a nest of my softest blankets and a t-shirt I had worn the day before. When a siren wailed in the distance, a sound that would have sent him into a panic, I saw his body tense. I immediately started humming, the low, tuneless sound that had always been his signal that everything was okay. His body relaxed, muscle by trembling muscle, He rested his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving my face, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of a soldier coming home from a war. I didn't sleep much that night. I just lay there, watching him. Watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, listening to the soft snores that meant he was finally, truly, deeply asleep. He was safe. He knew he was safe. And in his safety, I found my own. The cold knot of fear that had been lodged in my chest for months finally began to dissolve. The days and weeks that followed were a quiet, sacred process of healing. It was a journey back to the light. For both of us. The first order of business was food. He was so skinny. His ribs a visible, heartbreaking map beneath his dull coat. I started cooking for him. Warm meals of chicken and rice, things to soothe his anxious stomach. At first, he would only eat if I sat on the floor with him, my hand resting on his back. But slowly, day by day, his appetite returned. The dullness in his coat began to be replaced by a healthy golden sheen. The haunted, hollow look in his eyes began to fade. The small victories were the ones that mattered most, the ones that made me weep with a quiet, fierce joy. The first time he picked up a tennis ball and nudged my hand with it, his tail giving a hopeful, questioning wag. The first time he let out a happy, playful bark when I came home, instead of the frantic, anxious cries I had grown used to hearing about. The first time a thunderstorm rolled through and, instead of panicking, he just came and rested his heavy head on my lap, trusting me to be his anchor in the storm. His trust in the world had been shattered by Mark's neglect, but his trust in me was absolute, unbreakable. He was my shadow once more, following me from room to room, a constant, warm presence at my feet. The silence of my apartment was filled again with the familiar, comforting sounds of his life. The click-clack of his nails on the hardwood floor, the jingle of his collar, the soft thud of his tail against a cabinet when he was happy. I heard about Mark, of course. You always do in a small world. Sarah called me about a month after the hearing. She had run into him at a grocery store. She said he looked diminished. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful bitterness. He had lost weight. His expensive suit seemed to hang off him, and he looked older, grayer. The story of what had happened in that courtroom had spread like wildfire through our social circle. He hadn't just lost a dog, he had been publicly unmasked. His carefully constructed image as a charming, successful man had been exposed as a fraud. He was no longer the manipulator, the one pulling the strings. He was just a petty, cruel man who had been bested. I felt a flicker of something. Not triumph, not even satisfaction. Just a kind of distant, clinical finality. He was a chapter of my life that was now, finally, blessedly, closed. His power over me was gone. He had tried to break me by taking the thing I loved most, and instead, he had only revealed how much stronger my love was than his hate. And so, I sit here now, in my quiet living room, the city lights twinkling outside my window. It is no longer an empty-feeling room. It is a home. Finn is asleep at my feet, his body curled into a perfect golden circle. He occasionally lets out a soft snore or a little sleepy whimper, his paws twitching as he chases phantom rabbits in his dreams. He is healthy. He is happy. He is safe. This whole journey, this brutal, agonizing war, wasn't just about getting my dog back. It was about reclaiming my peace, my power. It was about finding my own voice, a voice that Mark had spent years trying to silence. It was about proving to myself and to the world that love real, fierce, unconditional love is not a weakness. It is the most powerful, most formidable force in the universe. True family isn't always blood. It isn't defined by a piece of paper from a courthouse or a city hall. It's forged in the quiet moments of care. It's built on a foundation of unwavering love, of compassion, of showing up for each other, especially when one of you can't fight for yourself. Finn was my family, and I would have gone to the ends of the earth for him. This fight taught me something profound. In the act of standing up for the most vulnerable member of my family, I found my own strength. In fighting for his voice, I rediscovered my own. And in healing his trauma, I began to heal my own. Have you ever fought for something so deeply personal, for someone you loved so fiercely? Share your story in the comments below. Let's build a community that understands, a community that stands up for the voiceless. Your stories matter. They create a space where none of us have to feel alone in our battles. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe that pets are family, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories of justice and finding strength in the face of adversity, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Finally, consider supporting your local animal welfare organizations, your local rescues and shelters, because every Finn out there deserves a Clara. Every lost, scared, anxious soul deserves a chance to come home. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share my story, our story.